Well, welcome to another Howard's Orchid video here in Cambridge, where it has been a very different summer to most previous summers, and particularly last year when we had a complete drought. It has meant that our lawn, and in fact all green open spaces in Cambridge, have stayed a beautiful emerald green this summer. It has been, however, quite cool compared to last year, and quite a lot of the orchids took quite a long time to get going this year. Anyway, I think it's always interesting to see the way that people grow their orchids and their sort of routines and habits that they form in order to get the best out of their plants. Every morning I come out and go around and moisten all the orchids that are growing on mounts or have lots of aerial roots hanging down. This is just pure rainwater, which is collected off the glass roof of the conservatory and kept in 2 water butts outside. So I just go round and make sure everything is nicely moistened. And I always do this in the morning because it's very important to make sure, particularly in the winter, that the foliage and particularly any sort of crevices between newly developing leaves have dried out completely. And most orchids really need that sort of wet-dry cycle, and if you spray later in the day you can't guarantee that that's the case. And then once a week, normally at the weekend, I bring out my sort of movable tea trolley with a basin of rainwater with fertiliser added into it and a sort of makeshift draining rack. And then I'll go around, and normally I do one side of the greenhouse one day and then the following side the other day. And it takes me, I suppose, about 40 minutes or so to completely water all the orchids on one side. And I do that by taking each orchid in turn and pouring plenty of water through the pot and then letting it drain. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. Ideally, you should water each plant individually, pour water through the pot and let it drain away and waste the water. But that's fine if you live in a part of the world where you have an unlimited supply of rainwater, or whether you have water that comes out of the tap that is suitable for watering orchids with. In Cambridge, water is in very short supply, and I simply cannot afford to use that much water. Also, it would just pour all over the floor, and this is a conservatory as opposed to a sort of greenhouse with a gravel or soil floor. So you can't really have lots of water just spreading all over the floor. In this, which is rainwater, as I said, from the water butts, I mix in rain mix fertiliser, which I keep in a small quantity in a jam jar because it tends to absorb the moisture. And when I've mixed that up, I check the electrical conductivity with a conductivity meter to make sure that I've mixed it to about the right concentration. Over the years, I've watched many orchid videos, I've been to talks, read a lot of literature about watering and fertilising orchids. One thing I would say is that you can talk to 6 people, you can watch 6 different videos, and you get different answers from all of them. And you can tie yourself up in knots worrying about precisely what fertiliser to feed your orchids with. My conclusion is that it's important to feed. It's very important not to overfeed. I make sure that the electrical conductivity, in other words, the concentration of chemicals in the water, is about 500 microsiemens. And I'll put that in the screen, what that's equivalent to in parts per million. And it's important not to feed too often, so all these orchids get fed about once a week, every week or 2 in the winter. I've talked to lots of people about fertilising orchids, and I've kind of given up reaching a definite opinion about what's best whether to use a particular mix in the summer and then switch to a different mix in the winter to encourage blooming. Well, a lot of these orchids are actually, their main growing period is in the winter. So if I switch to a bloom mix for the winter, that isn't going to suit some of the orchids. And it's such a big varied collection that they really just have to sort of get on with what they get. So that's enough about my approach to fertilising. And you'll notice that this is a sort of movable trolley, so it means that I can actually whiz round as quickly as possible, and wherever possible, to speed things up, I can take 2 orchids down at once, let them drain, and then put them back. One of the big advantages of going around and giving each plant this individual treatment is, I think, it gives you a chance to really focus on each plant and have a look to see how well it's doing. In the case of a plant that's growing, you can take, that's fairly well developed in its growing cycle, you can take it out, have a look at the roots and see how well they're doing. And I keep my pair of really strong reading glasses at arm's reach so that I can have a really good look. I'm sort of exaggerating now for sort of artistic purposes. Look at the undersides of the leaves, look down into the axils of the leaves, and make sure there are no pests. My approach to pests is one of constant vigilance and zero tolerance. Anytime I buy a new orchid, I will quarantine it, I will inspect it minutely, particularly for any scale insects and mealybugs. You can never be absolutely sure, no matter where you're getting an orchid from, that it is coming completely free of those 2 really bad pests. I also have a very strong hand lens, which is actually from the inside of a dismantled, damaged camera zoom lens. And that means that I can, if I suspect I've got red spider, or if there's a sort of patch or mark, and I can't tell just with my eyesight whether it's a pest or not, I can grab this, have a quick look, and identify what it is, and hopefully rest assured that it isn't a problem. And by doing that, I would say 99% of the time, probably more, I do not have mealybugs or scale insects on any of the plants in this greenhouse. And the reason that that is the case is that right from the start I have been absolutely fastidious about looking after my plants, inspecting them very carefully, and then quarantining and inspecting any new plants that come in. If you have inspected new plants that come in, be sure to inspect them periodically, every few days at first, and then maybe every week. A few days ago I found, and this was horrifying to me, I found a mealybug on a shoot of an orchid just over there. And the reason for that is that it was probably a very tiny one that I didn't spot the first time on a new orchid that I bought from somebody. So you do have to be incredibly careful, but believe me, especially if you don't, this is rather a big collection now, if you only have a small collection, it is possible to keep your plants completely free of pests. Right, so that's all I have to say about that. Please don't bombard me with lots of questions about individual pests and how to deal with them. There are lots of videos on orchid problems and I don't really want to go into it here. Right, now that's enough about routine and chores and nasty things like pests and diseases. I'm going to show you a couple of new orchids that I've got that have come into flower that I really love. This is an Oberonia. Now, I must say I do like some of the more unusual looking orchids, and this one, there are 3 flower spikes from this time last year that I left on. I normally cut dead flower spikes off, but I thought that was quite interesting and it gave me a reference to see how many I would get the following year, which is this year. I've got 4, which is good. But the flowers are absolutely minute, some of the tiniest flowers imaginable in the orchid kingdom. And this has got another week or so to go before all the flowers are completely out, but I think that these sort of browny orangey tassels are really beautiful. It is growing and has been growing on this piece of cork for quite a few years. The thing I've found with Oberonias, and I've got 2 other species, and I really love them because they're so unusual and so sort of weird looking. I have found that it is very important that they don't stay constantly moist. I've got one in particular. If the foliage and particularly the base of the stems, which are actually very sort of congested together, if they stay moist, they can very easily get rot in. So I have it hanging up where it gets quite a lot of air movement, and I'm very careful. When I go around spraying, I try to wet the mount and the aerial roots and don't wet the foliage, particularly if it's not, I mean, it's not so bad today because it's a sort of summery day, but at other times of the year, if the weather is dull, it's very important to make sure that no moisture lodges and remains very long where it shouldn't do. But I think this is a really lovely orchid. Not many people grow Oberonias, they're not very popular, but I really love them. And I'd quite like more. They're not very easy to find actually, which is quite interesting. And then this has to be one of the weirdest, most unusual looking orchids imaginable. This is Robiquetia cerina, which comes from Papua New Guinea at about 300 metres, 350 metres. So it's really hot to warm growing. So in theory, I shouldn't be able to grow this, but I keep it down on a bench here where it's nearest the source of heat in the winter. And I obviously just about get away with it, which I'm very pleased about. I've had this for 3 years. So this is the 3rd growing season, and this is the first time that I've got it to flower. It obviously has a little way to go before a lot more of the flowers open, and they don't open fully. They sort of remain sort of almost just about open. You know what I was saying about moisture lodging in the axils of the leaves? All these orchids have been watered this morning, and you can see actually that it's still got drips on it, and there's water in the axils. But it's only about 11:30 in the morning, so there's plenty of time for all this to dry off completely before nightfall and the temperature drops and the humidity goes up. And this one, like many of my orchids, is growing in a wooden basket, which is now quite old. The roots are pretty healthy. This is a new one coming here. You can see when I first had it, it was a bit wobbly, so I attached it with some sort of stretchy plastic to make sure it was nicely secure. And what I'm going to do when it's finished flowering is actually go in and pick out a lot of these, what are now getting rather old, mossy, slightly degraded bits of bark in there, pick them out, sort of turn it upside down and sort of jiggle it around so that a lot of the old bits of bark fall out. So instead of, obviously I can't repot it because I can't take it out of the basket, but what I can do is refresh as much of the bark that's in here as possible. Now, I'll just finish off with 1 or 2 miniature orchids. This is a miniature Phalaenopsis, Phalaenopsis deliciosa alba. I haven't had this very long, and I mounted it on a piece of cork oak. It came typically for many of the Phalaenopsis that are imported, I think, from Asia, stuffed in a really tightly packed pot of sphagnum moss, which I have found is almost instant death to orchids in this particular climate. So I took it out of that, carefully removed as much of the moss as possible, just left a little tiny bit to give it a bit to sort of tide over, and it's now started making lots of nice new root growth. And it has rewarded me quite quickly with this delicate little flower spike, really lovely. You'll notice over here, this is my Coleogyne Edwardi, which has just come into flower with its beautiful scent, so I can smell it from here whilst filming. This is Ornithocephalus inflexus, which is another delicate little miniature orchid. Has these tiny little white flowers. You can see these aren't out yet, but it's just about at its peak. Has very fine, very sort of hairy roots, which I've read needs to dry out between waterings. And you quite often find that with a lot of these miniatures. You think they need to be kept constantly moist, but not so with many of them. They need, like many orchids, that sort of wet-dry cycle. Otherwise you can get rot developing. You can see it's got some moss, but not a too abundant growth of moss. It's mounted, unfortunately, on a bit of composite cork, which is actually what it came on when I got it about 4 or 5 years ago. But it seems to be holding out quite well and hasn't sort of disintegrated, which they sometimes can. Because, of course, the trouble with mounted orchids is it's very difficult to remount them without doing quite a lot of damage to the existing roots. Right, well that's about it for this Howard's Orchid video. Hope to see you in the next one, and I hope that whilst you've been watching, you've got a bit sort of better impression of how I managed to grow some of my orchids. Not always really successfully, but hopefully successfully in many cases. So cheerio from me and enjoy your orchid growing.